My parents kicked me out in 12th grade for being pregnant. 16 years later, they showed up at my doorstep with a court order demanding to see the child. When I opened the door and heard their threats, I just smiled. What child? I asked them. Are you talking about the CEO of the investment fund that just bought your debt? My name is Rachel, and I am 34 years old. Today, I am the founder of Aegis Medical Solutions, a healthcare technology firm valued in the hundreds of millions. But 16 years ago, I was just a terrified teenager thrown into the freezing snow by the people who were supposed to protect me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire after your family tried to destroy you. The morning the nightmare returned started like any other Tuesday in my Silicon Valley estate. The California sun was casting a warm golden glow over my infinity pool, and my private chef had just set down a plate of breakfast on the massive marble kitchen island. I was sitting on a velvet bar stool, calmly reviewing the quarterly financial projections for my company, when the heavy brass knocker on my custom oak front doors began to pound with an aggressive, frantic rhythm. My estate is secured by a gated entrance and a private road. Nobody just wanders up and knocks on my front door. I pressed the intercom button on my tablet, expecting to hear a routine update from my head of security. Instead, the voice that crackled through the speaker made the blood freeze in my veins. Open this door right now, Rachel. We know you are in there. It was Barbara, my mother. I did not panic. I did not shake or tremble. The terrified 18-year-old girl who used to cry and beg at the sound of her mother's raised voice had died a very long time ago. In her place was a woman who regularly navigated boardrooms full of ruthless venture capitalists and corporate sharks. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, smoothed the fabric of my tailored blazer, and walked unhurriedly toward the grand foyer. When I pulled open the heavy double doors, I was greeted by a scene that almost made me laugh. There were 3 people standing on my pristine porch. The first was a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit holding a thick manila envelope. The other 2 were my parents, Barbara and Richard. They looked significantly older, their faces deeply lined with stress and the undeniable, exhausting signs of fading wealth. Richard wore a golf polo that had clearly seen better days, and Barbara clutched a designer handbag that was at least 5 seasons out of date, trying desperately to project an aura of upper-class superiority that no longer existed. Rachel. The man in the cheap suit stepped forward and thrust the manila envelope aggressively toward my chest. You have been served. I did not reach for the papers. I let the heavy envelope fall to the imported Italian tile floor at my feet with a dull thud. I did not even look at the process server. My eyes were fixed entirely on the 2 people standing behind him. You have a lot of nerve showing up at my home? I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. This is not a social visit, Richard snapped. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest with that same arrogant, domineering posture he used to use to intimidate me when I was a helpless child. He tried to look past me into the sprawling foyer, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the vaulted ceilings, the sweeping glass staircase, and the modern art pieces hanging on the walls. I could practically see the rapid, greedy calculations happening in his head, the sudden, overwhelming realization of exactly how much wealth I possessed. We are suing you for grandparents' rights, Barbara announced, lifting her chin and trying to look down her nose at me, a difficult task, considering I was wearing 4-inch heels and standing on the elevated threshold. The court is going to compel you to give us access. We have a fundamental legal right to our grandchild, and you cannot keep hiding him from his family forever. Hand over the child, Rachel. I looked down at the wrinkled court summons lying on the floor, then back at the 2 people who had thrown me out like garbage when I needed them most. The sheer audacity of their demand was so spectacular, so completely detached from reality, that a genuine cold laugh escaped my lips. Hand over the child, I asked, leaning casually against the heavy oak doorframe. What child are you referring to, Barbara? Are you talking about the CEO of the investment fund that just bought all your toxic debt? The smug, entitled satisfaction on Barbara's face faltered instantly. Richard frowned, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. What kind of nonsense are you talking about? Richard demanded, his voice rising in volume as his frustration leaked through. We are talking about Leo. We know his name. We know he is 16 years old. The law grants us the right to a relationship with our grandson, and we are here to collect. I crossed my arms and stared at them with absolute freezing indifference. You do not have a grandson, I stated flatly. You have a biological anomaly that you ordered me to scrape out of my body 16 years ago. You do not get to show up at my $8 million estate, hand me a worthless piece of paper, and demand access to a human being you actively tried to erase from existence. The process server, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating and intensely personal family drama, muttered a quick excuse and practically sprinted down my long driveway toward the main gate. I watched him leave, noting with satisfaction that my security team had already arrived at the perimeter, standing silently in the shadows waiting for my signal. My cold dismissal ignited the exact explosive toxic rage I remembered so well from my miserable childhood. Barbara's face flushed a mottled, ugly red, the veins in her neck bulging as she completely lost the thin veneer of upper-class respectability she fought so hard to project to the world. You are still as insolent and disrespectful as you were the night I threw you out into the street. Barbara shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the stone pillars of my entryway. You think because you have a fancy house and money now that you are better than us? You are nothing but a stubborn, ungrateful brat. I told you to get an abortion. I told you that bringing a bastard child into this family would completely ruin Ashley's engagement party. But you had to be selfish. You had to ruin everything. The memory crashed over me not with pain, but with a chilling, crystal-clear focus. It was late January. The snow was falling in thick, heavy, freezing sheets. I was 18 years old, completely terrified, and 3 months pregnant. My older sister Ashley, the absolute golden child, the perfect daughter who could do no wrong in their eyes, was hosting her lavish engagement party in our formal dining room. Hundreds of wealthy, influential guests were sipping expensive champagne and eating imported caviar. I had just pulled my mother aside into the kitchen, crying, confiding in her about my pregnancy, begging for her help and guidance. Instead of holding me, Barbara had grabbed me by the arm and dragged me to the back door. She threw 3 black garbage bags full of my clothes out into the snowbank. Richard had stood in the doorway swirling a glass of scotch and coldly told me that failures and public embarrassments did not sleep under his roof. They locked the heavy door right in my face. I sat in the freezing snow for 4 hours, listening to the muffled sounds of the string quartet playing for Ashley's party, while I wrapped my arms around my stomach in a desperate attempt to keep my baby warm. You remember that night clearly, do you? I asked, my tone dropping to a sharp whisper that easily cut through her unhinged screaming. You remember prioritizing Ashley's fancy cocktail party over the life of your own daughter and your unborn grandchild. Ashley deserved a perfect night. Barbara yelled, completely unrepentant and furious that I dared to bring up her cruelty. She was marrying a respectable, wealthy man. She was doing things the right way. You were a total disgrace to our name. You should have gotten rid of that problem when I told you to. And now you owe us. You owe this family for the shame you caused. I owe you absolutely nothing, I said, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. And let me make one thing perfectly clear to both of you. You are trespassing on private property. I casually reached into my blazer pocket and pressed the silent panic button on my phone. Within seconds, the sound of heavy boots crunching against the gravel driveway echoed through the crisp morning air. 4 men dressed in tailored black suits materialized from the side of the house. These were not rent-a-cops. They were highly trained ex-military private security contractors that I employed full-time to protect my property and my peace of mind. Escort these trespassers off my estate, I commanded, not taking my eyes off Richard's suddenly pale face. If they resist, call the local police and press charges for harassment and trespassing. The lead security officer, a massive, imposing man named David, stepped seamlessly between me and my parents. Ma'am, sir, you need to leave the premises immediately. He stated, his voice rumbling with a quiet, lethal authority. Richard's eyes darted frantically from the heavily armed security guards back to me, his previous bravado rapidly deflating like a punctured balloon. "You cannot do this, Rachel. We have a court order. We have a legal constitutional right to see Leo. We are not leaving until we see the boy." "You can wave that piece of paper around all you want, Richard," I said, taking a step back inside my foyer and preparing to close the door. "But it is completely useless here. You have no legal rights. You have no moral rights. You are nothing to me." "Wait." Barbara suddenly lunged forward, trying to physically push past the security guard, but David easily and painlessly blocked her path, stopping her cold. Her anger suddenly shifted into a desperate, frantic panic that caught me off guard. "You do not understand. We do not want to take him from you. We just need him. We need Leo." I paused, my hand resting heavily on the brass door handle. The pure, unadulterated desperation in her voice was so incredibly unlike the arrogant, dismissive woman I knew. Barbara never begged unless there was something massive, something life-altering at stake. I looked at her carefully, analyzing the frantic, sweating energy, noting the way Richard's hands were suddenly shaking at his sides. "Need him for what?" I asked coldly. "It is Ashley's son," Barbara blurted out, her voice cracking as genuine tears spilled over her heavily made-up cheeks. "Your nephew. He is very sick, Rachel. He has end-stage renal failure. Both of his kidneys are completely failing. The waitlist for a pediatric transplant is years long. He does not have years. He does not even have months." The scattered pieces fell into place with sickening, horrifying speed. The sudden appearance after 16 years of absolute silence. The desperate, aggressively filed court order for grandparents' rights. They did not want to bake cookies with Leo. They did not want to take him to baseball games or build a loving family relationship. They were hunting for spare parts. "You are looking for an organ donor," I stated, the sheer unimaginable horror of their plan settling over me like a sheet of suffocating ice. "You tracked us down, hired process servers, and filed a frivolous lawsuit just so you could legally force a judge to compel my 16-year-old son to take a tissue-matching test. You want to harvest my son's organs to save Ashley's kid. He is family." Richard shouted, his face turning an ugly mottled red again as he tried to justify the utterly unjustifiable. "Leo is his cousin. They share blood. It is a biological match waiting to happen. You have to let him get tested. It is a simple standard surgery to save a boy's life. You cannot be so evil and cruel as to let a child die when your son has two perfectly good kidneys." I stared at the man who contributed to my DNA. The absolute lack of basic human empathy, the sociopathic entitlement to my child's physical body was staggering. 16 years ago, they threw me into a deadly blizzard hoping the freezing cold would solve their public relations problem. They hoped I would miscarry. They hoped we would just disappear and die quietly. And now they wanted to slice my son open to save the child of the sister who had happily danced to a string quartet while I froze in the snow. "My son is not a medical supply closet for your golden child," I said, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with a lethal icy calm that made even my security guards stand a little straighter. "You threw us out to die. Do not you dare come to my home preaching about family blood or saving a child's life." "Rachel, please." Barbara was openly weeping now, reaching her shaking hands out toward me, desperate to bridge the gap she had created. "Ashley is totally devastated. Her husband left her. She is completely drowning in medical debt. She cannot afford the dialysis much longer. Please, you have so much money. You have so much power now. Just tell Leo to take the test. It is just a simple blood test." The mention of Ashley's husband leaving her and her impending financial ruin registered in my mind, but it did not stir a single solitary ounce of pity. I looked at Barbara's tears and felt nothing but absolute pure contempt. "David," I said, turning my head slightly to look at my head of security, "remove them, now." David and his highly trained team moved in instantly, physically placing themselves against my parents and forcing them backward down the long driveway. Barbara screamed, thrashing wildly against the security officer's firm but gentle grip. Richard stumbled backward, realizing very quickly that his usual physical intimidation tactics were entirely useless against men who had served in actual combat zones. "You will regret this," Richard bellowed as he was pushed toward the massive iron gates of my estate. His face was contorted with a vicious, ugly rage. "We are not giving up. We will take you to family court. We will drain your bank accounts with legal fees until you comply with the judge." I stood on the marble steps of my porch watching them being herded away like the pathetic trespassers they were. I did not bother responding to his empty financial threats. Aegis Medical Solutions pulled in hundreds of millions in revenue annually. I could keep them buried in court litigation until the end of time without making a dent in my personal wealth. But Richard had one last dirty weapon to throw at me. Just as the security guards were forcing them out the main gate, Richard violently turned back. He grabbed the iron bars of the gate, his knuckles turning stark white, and screamed at the top of his lungs so his voice would carry all the way up the driveway to my front porch. "You think you are so untouchable in your mansion?" Richard yelled, his voice scraping raw against the morning air. "My lawyers did not just file for grandparents' rights, Rachel. They did some digging. They found Jason." My breath caught painfully in my throat. My hand tightened on the brass door handle so hard my manicured nails bit deeply into my palm. "That is right!" Richard screamed, a triumphant, malicious grin spreading across his face. "We found the biological father. We paid him a very lucrative visit. He is extremely interested in meeting his son. You have no chance of winning this. We will see you in court." The heavy iron gates swung shut automatically, cutting off the rest of his words and locking them outside on the public street. The security guards took up their posts, their eyes scanning the perimeter, ensuring the threat was fully neutralized. I stood alone on my porch, the warm California sun suddenly feeling very cold. Jason. The name was a dark ghost from a past I had worked relentlessly to bury. The man who had ruined my teenage years. The man who had run away the absolute second things got difficult. My parents had dragged him out of the shadows, unleashing a monster they could not possibly control, all to get their greedy hands on my son's organs. They truly thought they had outsmarted me. They thought bringing Jason into the picture would force my hand, terrify me into submission, and break the impenetrable fortress I had built around Leo and myself. I reached down and picked up the crumpled court summons from the floor of my foyer. I smoothed out the wrinkled paper, looking at the legal jargon demanding my presence in family court. They wanted a war. They wanted to use the legal system to corner me and butcher my child for spare parts. I closed the heavy oak doors, the solid thud echoing through the massive, quiet house. I walked back to my kitchen island, picked up my tablet, and pulled up the highly classified financial portfolio of my son's private holding company. I looked at the specific debt acquisitions we had finalized over the past 6 months. Let them bring Jason. Let them bring their expensive lawyers. Let them bring the entire legal system to my doorstep. They had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into a trap that had been set and primed for over half a year. They thought they were the predators hunting a frightened teenage girl. They did not realize that the girl was dead, and they had just stepped into the den of a monster with unlimited capital. 72 hours later, their empty threats materialized into a mandatory mediation session at the Santa Clara County Family Court. The mediation room was exactly what you would expect from a government building. Cold, sterile, bathed in harsh fluorescent lighting, and smelling faintly of industrial floor cleaner. I sat on one side of a long mahogany table flanked by Mr. Harrison, my lead corporate litigator, who usually handled billion-dollar tech acquisitions but had gladly stepped in to completely dismantle my family. Across the table sat Richard, Barbara, and my sister Ashley. Ashley looked terrible. The golden child who used to strut around in designer gowns now wore a baggy, faded sweater. Her hair was unwashed, and she clutched a crumpled tissue, dabbing constantly at her bloodshot eyes. Next to them sat their lawyer, a slick, fast-talking man named Mr. Klein, who clearly thought he was about to secure an easy emotional victory against an estranged sibling. The court-appointed mediator, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, folded her hands on the table. "We are here to discuss the petition for grandparents' rights and the emergency medical request for a minor tissue matching test," she stated evenly. The petitioners claim that the minor Leo is a viable candidate for a life-saving transplant for his cousin. Mr. Klein immediately leaned forward, putting on his best performance of profound familial tragedy. Madam Mediator, we are dealing with a matter of life and death. My clients are simply asking for basic compassion. Ashley is a desperate bankrupt mother watching her child slowly die on dialysis. Her husband has abandoned her. She has sold everything she owns to pay for medical treatments. She has absolutely nothing left. We are begging the court to allow testing because Leo is the only viable family match remaining. Ashley let out a perfectly timed dramatic sob, burying her face in her hands. Please, Rachel, she cried, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. I know we have our differences. I know Mom and Dad made mistakes in the past. But my little boy is innocent. You cannot punish him for our sins. I have lost everything. I am completely broke. I will do anything you want. Just please save my son. Barbara reached out and patted Ashley's back, glaring at me with self-righteous indignation. You see what you are doing, Barbara snapped. You are sitting there in your expensive suit while your own flesh and blood begs for her life. Have you no soul? Mr. Harrison did not even flinch. He simply turned to me and gave a microscopic nod. I unclasped my leather briefcase and pulled out a single neatly printed sheet of paper. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their emotional hysteria. I simply slid the paper across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of the mediator. You have lost everything, Ashley. I asked, my tone dripping with freezing sarcasm. You are completely bankrupt and desperate. Yes, Ashley cried, refusing to look at the paper. Every penny goes to the hospital. That is fascinating, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. Because according to that authenticated financial subpoena my legal team obtained during discovery, you walked into a luxury boutique on Rodeo Drive exactly 6 days ago. You did not buy dialysis equipment. You did not pay off medical debt. You dropped $30,000 on a rare limited edition Hermes Birkin bag. The silence in the mediation room was so sudden and absolute it was deafening. The mediator picked up the document, adjusting her glasses as she scanned the highlighted transaction. The crisp black ink detailed the exact date, time, and astronomical price of the luxury handbag. Ashley's fake sobbing stopped instantly. She dropped her tissue, her face draining of color as she stared at the bank statement in absolute horror. Richard and Barbara exchanged a panicked, terrified look. Even their lawyer, Mr. Klein, sat back in his chair, his slick confidence completely evaporating as he realized his client had just committed blatant perjury during a recorded mediation session. You lied to this mediator, I said, ensuring my voice carried clearly to the official court stenographer. You lied about your financial ruin to garner sympathy while simultaneously demanding the state force a teenager to undergo major invasive surgery. You do not care about your son's life, Ashley. You care about maintaining your lifestyle, and you expect me to sacrifice my child's organs so you can save your money for designer handbags. Mr. Klein scrambled to interject. Madam Mediator, this is highly irregular. My client's personal spending habits do not negate the medical emergency of her son. Your client just committed perjury regarding her financial desperation. The mediator stated sharply, her previous sympathy completely gone, replaced by professional disgust. This mediation was called under the pretense of absolute transparency. Before Mr. Klein could formulate another pathetic defense, the heavy wooden door to the mediation room swung open. The bailiff stepped inside, looking slightly confused. Excuse me, the bailiff said. There is a man outside claiming he is a vital party to this petition. He says his name is Jason, and he is the biological father. Richard let out a sharp, triumphant breath, his chest puffing out once again. He looked at me, a malicious, victorious smirk spreading across his face. Bring him in, Richard demanded loudly. The biological father has a right to be here. Let us see what you have to say when the boy's actual father demands the test. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and a man stepped into the sterile light of the mediation room. It was Jason. 16 years had not been kind to him. He wore a faded denim jacket that smelled faintly of stale smoke, and his eyes carried the nervous, shifting energy of a man looking for a quick payout. He puffed out his chest, trying to mirror Richard's aggressive posture, but he just looked pathetic. "Hello, Rachel," Jason said, attempting a confident smirk that failed miserably. "It has been a long time. I hear my son needs me to sign some paperwork." I did not even blink. I did not look at his face. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on the mediator. "Mr. Harrison," my lead corporate litigator stood up slowly. He casually buttoned his suit jacket, radiating the kind of lethal, high-priced legal menace that made men like Jason instinctively shrink backward. "Madam Mediator," Mr. Harrison said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Under the California Family Code, an alleged biological father who has not been present for a single day of a minor's 16-year life, who has never established legal paternity, and who possesses no court-ordered custodial rights, has absolutely zero legal standing in this room. Furthermore, given that opposing counsel's primary client just committed documented blatant perjury regarding her financial status, this mediation is not only compromised, it is an insult to the judicial process." The mediator did not hesitate. She had already seen enough. She snapped her notebook shut and shoved it into her leather briefcase. "We are done here," the mediator announced, coldly standing up and glaring directly at Richard and Mr. Klein. "This session is terminated. Mr. Klein bringing an unverified non-legal party into a confidential mediation to ambush the respondent is a severe violation of protocol. Combined with your client's fraudulent financial claims, I will be submitting a formal report to the family court judge. I suggest you advise your clients to tread very carefully before they find themselves facing sanctions." We walked out of the room, leaving my family and Jason standing in a stunned, humiliated silence. They had tried to trap me with emotional warfare, and they had been crushed by cold, hard facts. But I knew the war was not over. When a parasite realizes it cannot feed through the front door, it immediately looks for a crack in the foundation. Ashley, stripped of her legal leverage and humiliated by the exposure of her luxury shopping habits, realized she could not win in a courtroom governed by perjury laws. So she took her fight to a place where facts did not matter at all, the court of public opinion. Less than 48 hours after the failed mediation, I was sitting in my home office analyzing a potential merger when my private secure phone line began to vibrate aggressively. It was Sarah, the head of public relations for Aegis Medical Solutions. "Rachel, you need to turn on your computer right now," Sarah said, her voice tight with an anxiety I rarely heard from her. "We have a massive situation. Your sister just dropped a nuclear bomb on social media." I opened my browser and navigated to the link Sarah sent me. There was Ashley. She had completely abandoned the designer clothes and the perfect salon blowouts. She was sitting on a faded, unremarkable sofa wearing a baggy, cheap gray sweatshirt. Her hair was intentionally messy, pulled into a loose bun, and she wore absolutely no makeup. The lighting in the room was dim and depressing. It was a masterclass in visual manipulation. "Hi, everyone," Ashley said to the camera, her voice trembling perfectly. Her eyes were wide and brimming with unshed tears. "I do not usually do this, but I am a desperate mother, and I have nowhere else to turn. My little boy is dying. He has end-stage renal failure and his body is giving up. We found a perfect match. A family member who could save his life with a simple standard procedure." She paused, letting a single tear roll down her cheek. "But his aunt refuses to help," Ashley sobbed, looking directly into the lens. "My sister Rachel is the CEO of Aegis Medical Solutions. She is a billionaire. She has built an empire on healthcare and saving lives. But because of a petty, silly family argument from when we were teenagers, she is hiding her son away. She is letting my little boy die just to punish me. Please, I am begging you to share this. Maybe if she sees how many people care, she will find her heart." I watched the video end and checked the metrics. It had been live for exactly 4 hours. It already had 3 million views. Ashley had engineered a perfectly weaponized piece of content. She hit every single algorithmic sweet spot required to manufacture a viral outrage machine. She presented the ultimate David versus Goliath narrative. The desperate, impoverished, weeping mother fighting against the cold, heartless billionaire corporate executive. She deliberately weaponized the name of my company, tying a personal family dispute directly to my corporate brand. The internet mob assembled with terrifying speed. People who had absolutely no idea about the 16 years of abuse, the abandonment in the freezing snow, or the $30,000 Hermes bag, immediately crowned Ashley a martyr and painted me as a monster. My inbox began flooding with hateful messages and violent death threats. The official social media accounts for Aegis Medical Solutions were entirely overrun by a digital army. The comment sections under our posts about new medical technology were hijacked by thousands of angry users. Boycott Aegis. Your CEO kills her own family. Money cannot buy a soul. The digital noise was an annoyance, but the real weapon Ashley aimed for was financial destabilization. We are a publicly traded company. Consumer sentiment and public relations disasters directly impact market capitalization. When the opening bell rang on Wall Street the next morning, the impact of the viral smear campaign was immediate. Aegis Medical stock opened down 2%. By lunchtime, the dip had widened to 4.5%. We were bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars in market value based entirely on a highly edited manipulative video recorded in a living room. My office phone rang again. This time it was the chief operating officer, and he was panicking. Rachel, the board of directors is getting incredibly spooked, he warned rapidly. We have major institutional investors calling to ask about the optics of this situation. The media is picking up the story. They are running headlines about the healthcare CEO refusing to provide healthcare to her own nephew. The board wants a statement. Frankly, some of them are suggesting you just pay the family whatever cash settlement they want to make this PR nightmare disappear. They want you to surrender to protect the stock price. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, looking out over the sprawling Silicon Valley landscape. They wanted me to surrender. They thought a temporary dip in the stock market and a bunch of angry comments from misinformed strangers would be enough to break me. They thought I would hand over my money, or worse, hand over my son just to silence the noise. I picked up the phone, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of fear. Listen to me very carefully, I told my chief operating officer. We do not negotiate with emotional terrorists, and we do not surrender to blackmail. Tell the board of directors to hold their positions. I am not giving that woman a single dime, and I am certainly not giving her my son. But the stock price, he argued weakly. The stock price will recover the minute I completely destroy her credibility, I stated coldly. Tell the legal department and the PR team to assemble in the main conference room in exactly 10 minutes. Ashley wants to use the media to play games. Fine. I will show her exactly what happens when you declare war on someone who owns the printing press. 10 minutes later, I pushed open the frosted glass doors of the main conference room. My crisis management team was already assembled. Sarah, my head of public relations, sat rigidly next to Mr. Harrison, who was calmly typing on his laptop. The large screens on the wall displayed real-time metrics of the social media storm Ashley had ignited. The red downward arrow next to our stock ticker was impossible to miss. Turn those screens off, I ordered, taking my seat at the head of the long glass table. I do not care about online comments. I care about legal and financial retaliation. Sarah, I want a press release issued from Aegis Medical Solutions within the hour. Keep it entirely corporate and utterly sterile. State that our company operates strictly within federal medical ethics guidelines and that we do not comment on frivolous personal litigation designed to extort our executives. Do not mention my sister by name. Do not mention my son. Give the internet absolutely nothing emotional to feed on. Sarah nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard. What about the accusations against you personally? She asked. People are calling you a monster. They want a response. I am not going to film a tearful reaction video in my kitchen, I said coldly. Arguing with internet mobs is what desperate people do. We fight with binding legal documents. Mr. Harrison, I want a cease and desist order drafted immediately. Already halfway done, Mr. Harrison replied, not looking up from his screen. I am citing severe defamation libel and tortious interference with your business operations. Make it vicious, I instructed. I want the cease and desist to explicitly list the damages she is causing to a publicly traded company. Remind her that tortious interference carries financial penalties in the tens of millions. But more importantly, include a copy of her $30,000 Hermes receipt. Attach the proof of her perjury from the mediation room. Inform her that if that video is not deleted and a public retraction is not posted within exactly 4 hours, we will pursue criminal fraud charges. I leaned back in my chair, watching my team execute the orders with flawless precision. My family had severely miscalculated my playing field. They thought they could bully me using public shame, forgetting that public shame is a weapon that swings both ways. Now, I said, shifting my attention back to Sarah. Let us handle my father. Richard believes he can hide behind his daughter's fake tears while organizing this entire extortion plot. It is time to strip away his respectable businessman disguise. I pulled a heavily encrypted flash drive from my blazer pocket and slid it across the glass table toward Sarah. What is this? Sarah asked, picking up the small silver drive. 6 months ago, when I realized my parents were hunting for Leo, I hired a team of forensic accountants to quietly audit my father's real estate brokerage, I explained smoothly. Richard has always loved to project extreme wealth, but his actual business practices are incredibly sloppy. That drive contains indisputable proof that his firm has been funneling unreported income through offshore shell companies for the better part of a decade. It also contains copies of several active federal subpoenas that the IRS recently issued to his accounting department. Sarah's eyes widened as she grasped the magnitude of what I had just handed her. You want me to release this to the press? No, I said, a sharp smile forming on my lips. Aegis Medical Solutions has absolutely nothing to do with Richard's tax evasion. However, it would be a terrible shame if a major financial journalist suddenly received an anonymous, highly detailed dossier regarding a massive federal tax fraud investigation into the family currently trying to extort a healthcare CEO. Package it up, send it to our contacts at the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg. Let the journalists do what they do best. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the cease and desist order arrived at Ashley's house. I was later informed by my security team that she had been in the middle of hosting a live stream, crying to thousands of viewers and begging for donations to a fake medical fund she had just set up. The process server walked right into the frame, handing her the thick stack of legal documents. Ashley made the spectacular mistake of opening the envelope while still streaming. Her viewers watched in real time as the color completely drained from her face. She saw the explicit threats of multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuits. She saw the attached proof of her luxury shopping sprees. The stream abruptly cut to black, but the internet never forgets. Her followers had already begun questioning her sudden panic. Exactly 45 minutes later, the financial news networks broke the second story. The headlines hit the internet like a targeted missile strike. Viral mother's family business under active federal investigation for massive tax fraud. The articles were brutal, surgical, and heavily detailed. They exposed Richard's failing real estate empire, the offshore accounts, and the staggering amount of money he owed the federal government. The tide of public opinion turned with violent, immediate force. The internet mob that had been demanding my head just hours ago suddenly realized they had been played. They had been donating money and offering sympathy to a family of wealthy fraudsters who were trying to extort a successful woman to pay off their federal tax debts. The comment sections shifted from attacking me to eviscerating Ashley and Richard. People began pulling up Ashley's old social media posts, analyzing her designer clothing, and pointing out the massive contradictions in her desperate mother routine. The hashtag that had been trending against my company vanished, replaced by a new one demanding Ashley return the donated funds. I sat in my office and watched the stock ticker on my wall. The red arrow flickered, turned green, and began a steady, aggressive climb upward. By the time the market closed, Aegis Medical Solutions had not only recovered the morning's losses, but had actually gained a percentage point. Wall Street loves a CEO who ruthlessly crushes a blackmail attempt. My private phone rang. It was Mr. Harrison. The video has been deleted, he reported, sounding entirely unsurprised. Ashley took down all her social media accounts 10 minutes ago. Richard's office is currently surrounded by local news vans asking for comments on the IRS investigation. They are completely contained. Excellent work, I replied, turning away from the window. Have the security team double the perimeter watch around my estate and Leo's school. They are backed into a corner now, and desperate animals do incredibly stupid things. I hung up the phone feeling a deep, solid sense of satisfaction. I had systematically dismantled their public attack without ever raising my voice or shedding a single public tear. I had exposed them for exactly what they were, but the satisfaction was short-lived. I knew Richard and Barbara better than anyone. They had lost the mediation. They had lost the public relations war. Their finances were being publicly exposed, and their golden child was a viral laughingstock. They had absolutely no legal or social leverage left, which meant they only had one card remaining to play, the dirtiest, most dangerous card in their deck. They were going to unleash Jason. The absolute destruction of Richard's public image happened faster than even I had anticipated. By Friday morning, federal agents were carrying boxes of financial records out of his corporate headquarters. Local news helicopters circled his office building, broadcasting the raid live across the state. Barbara had been permanently suspended from her country club, and Ashley had deleted every trace of her existence from the internet, hiding inside her foreclosed home. My security team reported that my parents' vehicles had not moved from their driveway in 2 days. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public and legal execution my PR team had orchestrated. To the outside world, it looked like a total, unconditional surrender. But I knew better. A cornered animal does not surrender. It waits for you to turn your back, and then it goes for the throat. The strike came on a Monday morning. I was sitting in my home office going over the final blueprints for a new pediatric wing my company was funding at the local hospital when my private elevator chimed. The polished steel doors slid open, revealing Mr. Harrison. He did not have his usual calm, composed demeanor. His tie was slightly loosened, and he was carrying a thick red legal binder that I immediately recognized as an emergency court filing. He walked straight to my desk and dropped the heavy binder onto the glass surface. The loud thud echoed in the quiet room. The grandparents' rights petition was officially withdrawn at 8 o'clock this morning, Mr. Harrison stated, his voice completely devoid of celebration. I did not smile. I looked at the red binder. They withdrew it because they knew they would be sanctioned for Ashley's perjury, I replied. Or because Richard can no longer afford his slick lawyer now that his assets are frozen by the federal government. Both are true, Mr. Harrison said, pulling out a chair and sitting down heavily. But that is not why they withdrew the petition. They withdrew it because the grandparents' rights lawsuit was never their actual strategy. It was a decoy. A smokescreen designed to force you into family court, distract our legal team, and legally compel you to acknowledge Leo's presence in this jurisdiction. They used that time to finalize their real weapon. He pushed the red binder toward me. Exactly 10 minutes after withdrawing their petition, a new lawsuit was filed in the California Superior Court. Mr. Harrison explained, his tone deadly serious. The plaintiff is Jason Miller. He has secured high-powered legal representation paid for entirely through an offshore account we can trace back to Richard. Jason is officially suing you for the immediate establishment of paternity, full enforcement of joint legal and physical custody, and retroactive interference with parental rights. I stared at the name on the cover of the binder. Jason Miller. The boy who had charmed me in high school got me pregnant, and then vanished into thin air the exact moment my parents threw me out into the winter snow. He had not contributed a single dime to Leo's existence. He had not sent a birthday card, a text message, or made a single phone call in 16 years. He was a ghost, a coward who ran away because my father threatened to ruin his life if he ever came near our family again. And now Richard was paying that same coward to come back and steal my son. This is absurd, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the sudden sharp spike of adrenaline in my chest. Jason abandoned us 16 years ago. He has zero established legal rights. Under California law, a biological father who makes absolutely no attempt to contact or support a child for over a decade cannot simply walk into a courtroom and demand joint custody. The judge will laugh him out of the building. We can get this dismissed for failure to state a claim before lunchtime. Mr. Harrison did not smile. He reached into the binder and pulled out a single sheet of paper enclosed in a clear, protective plastic sleeve. In a standard abandonment case, you would be absolutely correct, Mr. Harrison said, placing the plastic sleeve carefully on the glass desk. We could crush him instantly. But Jason is not claiming he abandoned you. He is claiming you kidnapped his son. And he attached Exhibit A to his emergency filing to prove it. I looked down at the document. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, a stark contrast to the crisp white legal filings surrounding it. At the top, in bold formal lettering, were the words Voluntary Declaration of Paternity and Joint Custody Agreement. The document outlined in highly specific legal jargon that Jason Miller was the acknowledged father of the child and that I, Rachel, explicitly agreed to grant him 50% physical and legal custody. It stated that I could not move the child out of the county without his written notarized permission. I scanned the bottom of the page. There, signed in trembling, uneven blue ink, was my name. My signature. Dated exactly 2 days after Leo was born. Beside my signature was the official stamp and seal of a state notary public. Jason is telling the court that he never abandoned his child, Mr. Harrison explained quietly. He is swearing under oath that he signed a legally binding joint custody agreement with you 16 years ago. He claims that immediately after this document was notarized, you vanished in the middle of the night. He is accusing you of hiding his son across state lines, changing your contact information, and deliberately violating a signed legal contract for 16 years. I stared at my signature. The jagged, messy letters brought the memory crashing back with violent force. The sterile smell of the hospital room, the agonizing pain of recovering from a difficult delivery, the exhaustion. And Richard walking into my recovery room with a strange man trailing behind him, shoving a clipboard into my face and screaming at me to sign the paperwork if I ever wanted him to pay my medical bills. I had been 18, broke terrified holding a newborn baby and completely alone. I had signed the paper just to make my father stop screaming. They had kept this piece of paper hidden in a vault for 16 years. A loaded gun waiting for the exact moment they needed to put a bullet in my life. With this document, Jason is not just a deadbeat dad asking for a favor, Mr. Harrison warned, his eyes locked on mine. He is a recognized legal guardian seeking immediate enforcement of his rights. The judge has already granted an emergency injunction. You are legally forbidden from moving Leo out of the state of California, and a mandatory hearing is scheduled for Thursday morning. If we cannot invalidate this contract, the judge will order a DNA test. Once paternity is established, Jason will have the legal authority to consent to Leo's medical procedures, including organ donation. They had found my one vulnerability. They had used my own terrified 18-year-old signature to build a cage around my son. Richard and Barbara were sitting in their foreclosed mansion right now, smiling, absolutely convinced they had delivered the final fatal blow. They thought this piece of paper would force me to my knees. They thought I would surrender Leo to the butcher's table to avoid going to prison for parental kidnapping. I slowly reached out and tapped the plastic sleeve containing the contract. I did not scream. I did not panic. A dark, terrifying calm washed over me, chilling my blood and focusing my mind with absolute razor-sharp clarity. They really think this changes everything, I said softly, a cold smile finally breaking across my face. They think bringing Jason into the light gives them the winning hand. Mr. Harrison watched me carefully. Does it? He asked. I looked up at my brilliant lawyer. I want you to file a response accepting the Thursday morning hearing I commanded. Do not try to block the paternity suit. Do not try to invalidate the signature. Let Jason walk into that courtroom. Let my parents sit in the gallery. Let them bring the judge, the media, and everyone else who wants to watch. But the joint custody agreement, Mr. Harrison objected, pointing at the document. It is notarized, Rachel. It is a massive legal hurdle. I know exactly what it is, I replied, standing up and buttoning my blazer. And I know exactly what Richard had to do to get that notary stamp on a Sunday night in a closed hospital ward. Tell the legal team to prepare the ultimate counterstrike. We are not just going to defeat Jason in family court. We are going to legally execute him in front of my parents. Open the gates, Mr. Harrison. Let the monsters in. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare and corporate strategy. While my legal team prepared the kill shot for Thursday morning, I continued running my company. I did not alter my schedule. I did not hide in my estate. I projected the image of a woman who was entirely unbothered by the pathetic circus happening outside her walls. Late Tuesday evening, I finally wrapped up a brutal quarterly earnings call with our international investors. The building was mostly empty. The sprawling glass and steel headquarters of Aegis Medical Solutions had gone quiet, the frantic daytime energy replaced by the low hum of the centralized climate control systems. I packed my tablet into my leather briefcase, turned off the overhead lights in my office, and took my private executive elevator down to the VIP underground parking garage. The garage was a massive subterranean concrete cavern. It was brilliantly lit, secured by a dedicated security team, and usually entirely empty, save for my custom-armored black SUV and the vehicles belonging to my top executives. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished concrete floor, echoing sharply in the quiet space. I was 10 feet away from my vehicle when a shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar near my driver's side door. "Hold on a second, Rachel." A raspy, nicotine-stained voice echoed through the garage. "We need to have a little chat." I stopped. I did not gasp. I did not drop my briefcase or reach for the panic button on my keys. I simply stood my ground and evaluated the threat. Jason stepped fully into the harsh fluorescent lighting blocking my path to the car. He looked significantly worse than he had during his brief cameo at the mediation center. The cheap denim jacket he wore was stained, and he possessed the jittery, vibrating energy of a man running entirely on cheap caffeine and mounting desperation. His face was weathered, deeply lined from years of hard living, and his eyes darted around the pristine garage with a mixture of awe and raw, unadulterated greed. He looked completely out of place in my world, like a rat that had managed to scurry into a surgical ward. "How did you bypass corporate security?" I asked, my voice calm, flat, and completely devoid of the fear he was clearly hoping to provoke. "Slipped in through the loading dock right behind a catering van," Jason replied, wiping his nose with the back of his hand and offering a crooked, arrogant grin. "Your fancy security guards are not as smart as you pay them to be, but do not worry, I am not here to hurt you. I am here to make a business deal." "You are trespassing on private corporate property," I stated smoothly. "You have exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out the way you came before I signal the night shift tactical team to physically remove you." Jason did not move. He puffed out his chest, stepping slightly closer, entirely misreading my calm demeanor for submission. He still thought he was dealing with the terrified, helpless 18-year-old girl he had abandoned in a snowstorm 16 years ago. He had absolutely no comprehension of the apex predator standing in front of him. "You do not want to call security, Rachel," Jason said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, threatening tone. "Because if you do, I will walk straight to the local news stations. I will tell them the CEO of Aegis Medical Solutions is having her child's legal biological father thrown out on the street. That will not look very good for your precious stock price, will it?" I remained perfectly still, letting him talk. When greedy men believe they hold all the cards, they inevitably talk too much. "Your old man Richard tracked me down a few weeks ago." Jason continued, leaning against the hood of my SUV as if he owned it. "He told me all about your fancy new life. The billions of dollars, the mansion, the private security. He also told me about the little problem with your sister's kid. Richard is a desperate guy right now. He offered me a very sweet deal to come back into the picture." I kept my face entirely blank, revealing nothing. "Richard paid me $50,000 cash just to sign the paternity lawsuit and show up in town." Jason confessed, a smug, self-satisfied chuckle escaping his lips. 50 grand just to bring that old custody agreement to a lawyer and agree to force a DNA test on Thursday morning. He told me that once I get joint custody established by the judge, I can sign the medical consent forms for Leo to donate his kidney to Ashley's kid. He promised me another 50 grand after the surgery is done. He paused, looking around the massive multi-million-dollar parking structure, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. But then I did some reading, Jason said, his voice lowering into a greedy whisper. I looked up your company. I saw the Forbes articles. You are worth billions, Rachel. Billions. And Richard thinks he can buy my loyalty for a miserable 100 grand. The man is cheap. And frankly, I do not care about Ashley or her sick kid. I care about getting what I deserve for keeping my mouth shut all these years. You want a payout? I stated, my tone analytical and deadpan. I want a massive payout, Jason corrected, stepping away from the car and standing directly in front of me. Here's the deal. Your parents paid me $50,000 to ruin your life. But if you give me $2 million untraceable, transferred into an offshore account by tomorrow night, I will withdraw the paternity lawsuit. I will rip up the custody agreement. I will not show up to family court on Thursday morning, and I will disappear forever. You get to keep your son, you get to keep his organs inside his body, and Richard loses his only weapon against you. He crossed his arms, looking incredibly pleased with his brilliant extortion strategy. $2 million is nothing to you, Rachel. It is a rounding error. Pay up, or I swear to God, I will walk into that courtroom on Thursday, I will establish my rights as Leo's father, and I will hand him right over to Richard's surgeons. I looked at the pathetic, filthy man trying to blackmail a billionaire. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply brought my left hand up and casually brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear. As my hand moved past my face, I pressed my thumb firmly against the side bezel of my custom-engineered smartwatch. I felt the tiny microscopic vibration against my wrist, confirming that the high-definition audio recording software had successfully activated and was actively backing up directly to my encrypted cloud-based legal server. Are you absolutely certain about this strategy, Jason? I asked, my voice ringing clearly in the quiet garage, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable. You are explicitly stating that Richard paid you $50,000 to file a fraudulent custody claim, and you are currently demanding $2 million from me to drop that exact same lawsuit. That is exactly what I am saying, Jason replied aggressively, completely oblivious to the digital trap snapping shut around his ankles. $2 million by tomorrow night, or your kid goes under the knife for Ashley's family. I hold the custody papers. I hold all the power here. Do not test me, Rachel. I lowered my hand, letting it rest casually at my side. A slow, terrifying, entirely genuine smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that usually made rival corporate executives sweat. Jason saw it, and for the first time since he stepped out of the shadows, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his arrogant features. You do not hold power, Jason, I said softly, my voice cold enough to freeze the air between us. You hold a matchstick, and you are standing in a room completely filled with gasoline. You want to play a high-stakes game in family court. On Thursday, I took a deliberate step forward, forcing Jason to instinctively take a step back. I highly suggest you wear a suit, I told him, my eyes locking onto his with lethal intensity. I will see you on Thursday. I bypassed him entirely, unlocked my armored SUV, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The massive vehicle roared to life, the headlights blinding him. I threw it into gear and drove toward the exit, leaving Jason standing alone in the underground garage, clutching his empty threats, entirely unaware that he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him, Richard and Barbara, all at once. I merged onto the highway, the adrenaline from the parking garage encounter slowly fading into a sharp, icy focus. Jason had given me exactly what I needed. The audio recording safely stored on my encrypted server was a definitive, legally binding confession of extortion and conspiracy. But I knew these cornered animals would not wait for Thursday morning's court hearing. By ignoring Jason's demand for a $2 million payoff, I had aggressively accelerated their timeline. They were out of money, out of legal leverage, and entirely out of patience. Desperate people are dangerously predictable. I knew they would immediately bypass me and go straight for the softest target they could think of: my son. My secure phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system before I even reached the city limits. It was David, my head of private security. He did not sound panicked, merely deeply annoyed. "Ma'am, we have a situation at the academy," David reported crisply over the speakers. "Three individuals matching the descriptions of your parents and Jason Miller are currently causing a massive disturbance at the main gates. They are demanding to see the boy and attempting to incite a crowd." I told David to hold the perimeter, but not to engage physically unless they actually breached the iron gates. I was only 5 minutes away. Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy was not a normal high school. It was an ultra-exclusive, heavily fortified academic fortress, nestled in the pristine hills of Silicon Valley, catering exclusively to the children of tech billionaires, venture capitalists, and foreign dignitaries. The annual tuition was astronomical, and the security protocol rivaled a Federal Reserve Bank. When my armored SUV pulled onto the manicured circular driveway of the academy, the scene playing out at the entrance was a pathetic, embarrassing display of manufactured drama. Richard, Barbara, and Jason were standing directly in front of the massive wrought iron security gates. Jason was holding up his cell phone, clearly live streaming the event to whatever internet audience he could muster, trying to reclaim the viral momentum Ashley had lost. Barbara was gripping the thick iron bars, weeping hysterically, performing for the camera with sickening dedication. "We just want to see our grandson," Barbara wailed loudly, ensuring her shrill voice carried over the immaculate stone courtyard. "His cruel mother is keeping him away from his biological father. We have legal rights. Please just let a desperate father see his boy." Richard stood right behind her, puffing out his chest, trying to look like a righteous patriarch, fighting against an unjust, corrupt system. He yelled at the stoic security guards standing on the other side of the gate, waving the wrinkled custody agreement in the air. "I have a signed legal document granting this man joint custody," Richard shouted, pointing aggressively at Jason. "You are harboring a kidnapped child. Bring the boy out here right now, or I am calling the local police and having your entire administration arrested for child abduction." They were hoping to create another viral spectacle. They were betting that the highly prestigious, scandal-averse academy would force me to hand over Leo just to avoid a public relations disaster on their pristine front lawn. They thought public shame would be the crowbar that finally broke my defenses. I parked my SUV a few yards away, stepping out, but remaining perfectly still in the dark shadow of a large ancient oak tree. I did not intervene. I did not rush forward to protect my child. I wanted to see exactly how far my family would take this pathetic charade. More importantly, I knew my son. He was not a fragile, sheltered child who needed to be shielded from the ugly realities of the world. I had raised a king, and kings do not hide in castles when peasants throw stones at the front gates. The heavy mahogany doors of the main academic building suddenly swung open. The shrieking from my parents instantly stopped. Jason lowered his phone slightly, his mouth falling open in surprise. Stepping out onto the sunlit stone courtyard was not a frightened, confused teenager looking for his mother. It was Leo. At 16 years old, my son already stood 6 feet tall. He moved with the effortless, predatory grace of someone who had grown up entirely comfortable in rooms filled with immense wealth and ruthless power. He was wearing his tailored charcoal gray school blazer, a crisp white shirt, and a vintage Patek Philippe watch on his left wrist. Flanking him on either side were two of my largest, most intimidating private security contractors, their faces completely expressionless behind dark sunglasses. Leo walked slowly down the stone path toward the iron gates. He stopped a few feet away from the bars, sliding his hands casually into his pockets. He looked at the 3 sweating, desperate people on the other side of the fence with an expression of absolute, freezing boredom. He looked at them the exact same way one might look at a stain on an expensive rug. Jason stepped forward, eagerly pressing his face close to the iron bars. He tried to muster a look of deep paternal affection, but his greedy eyes darted wildly over Leo's expensive clothes and the massive security detail standing behind him. "Leo," Jason said, his voice dripping with fake emotion. "I am your dad. I have been looking for you for 16 years. Your mother kept you from me, but I am here now. I have the legal papers to prove it. We are going to be a family. Barbara immediately chimed in, squeezing fresh fake tears from her eyes and reaching a trembling hand through the bars. Leo, sweetheart, we are your grandparents. We love you so much. We have a legal right to be in your life. We just want to bring you home and introduce you to your sick cousin. You can save his life. You are our hero. Leo did not flinch. He did not look surprised. He slowly pulled his right hand from his pocket and checked his watch, sighing softly as if he were being delayed from a far more important meeting. "You must be Jason," Leo said. His voice had dropped and carried the exact same lethal, icy cadence that I used to execute corporate takeovers. It was smooth, highly educated, and completely terrifying. The man who ran away because he was too much of a coward to handle an 18-year-old girl. And Richard and Barbara, the people who threw my pregnant mother into a freezing blizzard to protect a cocktail party. The fake loving smiles vanished from their faces instantly. Jason blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting the boy to know the dark, buried history. Richard's face flushed a deep, ugly red as his grand patriarch illusion was shattered by a teenager. "Your mother has brainwashed you," Richard snapped, abandoning the loving grandfather routine entirely. "She is a liar and a corporate tyrant. We have court orders. Jason has legal joint custody. You have to come with us right now." Leo let out a short, incredibly cold laugh. "You have a piece of paper you extorted out of my mother when she was bleeding and recovering in a hospital bed," Leo stated, taking a single intimidating step closer to the gate. "A piece of paper that Jason just offered to sell back to her for $2 million in a parking garage last night." Jason physically recoiled from the gate, his face draining of all color. The cell phone in his hand shook violently. "How do you know about that?" Jason stammered, his eyes darting around frantically, as he realized his secret extortion attempt was already completely known. "Because I am the primary shareholder of the trust that controls Aegis Medical Solutions," Leo stated, his voice ringing with absolute crushing authority. "My mother and I discuss every single financial threat against our assets. You came here today thinking you could manipulate a child into giving up a kidney to save the grandson of the woman who watched my mother freeze. You thought you could use biology as a weapon to extract cash." Leo looked directly into Jason's terrified eyes, his gaze dark and merciless. "You are not my father," Leo declared, his words hitting like physical blows. "You are a biological accident looking for a payday. And if any of you ever show up at my school again, my security team will not just stand here looking intimidating. They will break your legs and have you arrested for stalking and corporate espionage." I stepped out from the shadow of the oak tree, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my heels. My parents and Jason whipped their heads around, realizing for the first time that I had been standing there watching their entire humiliation unfold. I walked up to the gate and stood shoulder to shoulder with my son. The resemblance between our cold, calculating expressions was undeniable. We were an impenetrable wall of wealth power, an absolute unified contempt. "You played your final card, Richard," I said softly, my voice slicing effortlessly through the crisp afternoon air. "And you completely failed. Now I suggest you all go home and pack your bags, because tomorrow morning my lawyers are taking everything you have left." The silence that followed my statement was absolute. The crisp wind rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the academy driveway, providing the only soundtrack to the complete obliteration of my family's remaining illusions. Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The righteous patriarch routine had completely evaporated. Beside him, Barbara gripped the iron bars of the gate, her knuckles turning stark white, the fake tears drying instantly on her heavily made-up face. They had come here expecting a terrified teenage boy and a cornered mother. Instead, they had run face first into an impenetrable wall of corporate security and generational wealth that they could not manipulate. "This is a bluff!" Richard suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and impotent rage. "You cannot take anything from us. We are your family. We are taking you to court. Jason has rights." I did not even bother to look at my father. My eyes remained locked on Jason, who was currently sweating profusely in his cheap denim jacket. The phone in his hand, which he was using to broadcast this pathetic spectacle to his online followers, was trembling so violently that the footage had to be nauseating to watch. Jason realized the power dynamic had violently shifted. He looked at the two massive security contractors flanking my son. He looked at my custom-armored SUV. He looked at the cold, dead calculation in my eyes. The rat was trapped, and like all rats, his first instinct was to gnaw off his own leg to escape the trap. Or better yet, bite the person standing next to him. "Do not look at me," Jason suddenly spat, taking a sudden defensive step away from Richard and Barbara. "I am just a pawn in this. I did not want to come here today. Richard dragged me into this mess. He is the one who paid me. He is the one who wanted to steal the kid's kidney. I just wanted a quick payout and a ticket out of town." "You worthless piece of trash!" Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he lunged toward Jason. "You were supposed to be the ace up my sleeve. You were supposed to force her hand." Barbara shrieked, trying to grab her husband's arm, but the chaos was already spiraling out of their control. "Do not you dare put this on me, old man!" Jason yelled back, shoving Richard's hand away with startling violence. "Your whole family is rotten to the core. You think I am the bad guy. You think I ruined her life 16 years ago? I was just a dumb, broke kid looking for a good time." "It was Ashley. Your precious, perfect daughter Ashley was the one who set the whole damn thing up." The courtyard went dead silent again. Even the security guards stiffened slightly. I felt Leo shift his weight beside me, his protective instinct flaring, but I placed a gentle, calming hand on his shoulder. I let Jason keep talking. I let him dig the grave deeper. "What are you talking about?" Barbara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Ashley had nothing to do with you and Rachel. Ashley was a straight-A student." Jason let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed off the stone walls of the academy. "A straight-A student who was terrified her younger sister was about to take the spotlight," Jason sneered, pointing a grimy finger right at my mother. "You want the truth? Fine. Let us talk about the truth." 16 years ago, Ashley hated Rachel. She hated that Rachel was smarter, worked harder, and was on track to get the full academic ride to Stanford. Ashley wanted that Ivy League college fund you two had set aside, but she knew she was not smart enough to earn it as long as Rachel was in the picture. He turned his wild, desperate eyes back to me. "I never even looked twice at you back then, Rachel." Jason confessed, his voice echoing with ugly, unvarnished malice. "You were too quiet, too boring. It was Ashley who came to me at that winter formal. She handed me a bottle of vodka and $200. She told me she had already slipped something heavy into your soda. She said you were upstairs in the guest bedroom completely out of it, and if I went up there and made sure everyone saw us together the next morning, she would give me another $500. The air in my lungs turned to pure ice. For 16 years, I had blamed myself for a momentary lapse in judgment. I had carried the shame of a drunken teenage mistake that had resulted in my parents throwing me out into the snow. I had believed I was careless. I was not careless. I was hunted. "Ashley set you up!" Jason shouted, leaning against the iron gates, practically vibrating with the need to shift the blame. "She unlocked the bedroom door. She made sure her friends walked in on us. She wanted you ruined. She wanted you pregnant, disgraced, and kicked out of the house so she could be the only golden child left to inherit the kingdom. And it worked perfectly, did it not? You threw her out and Ashley got everything she wanted. I am just a guy who took a payout. Your own flesh and blood is the monster." Barbara let out a strangled, horrifying wail, collapsing against the stone pillar of the gate. Richard stood completely frozen, the color draining from his face, as the pristine, perfect illusion of his favorite daughter shattered into a million jagged pieces. They had sacrificed me, discarded me like trash to protect a predator who shared their DNA. Leo stepped in front of me, his tall frame shielding me from the sight of the people on the other side of the gate. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, his jaw set in a line of pure, lethal fury. He looked ready to order the security detail to dismantle the gate and drag them all into the street. I gently touched his arm silently, instructing him to hold his ground. I stepped out from behind my son. I did not scream. I did not cry. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression and mask of absolute terrifying serenity. I looked at Jason. He was breathing heavily, clutching his cell phone, looking incredibly proud of himself for deflecting the blame onto my sister. He thought his confession had earned him clemency. He thought laying the sins of the past bare would somehow absolve him of his current extortion attempt. "Thank you for admitting that, Jason," I said softly. My voice was calm, melodic, and entirely lethal. Jason blinked, a confused, greedy smile creeping onto his face. "So we have a deal. You will drop the charges. You will give me the money to disappear." I tilted my head slightly, gesturing gracefully toward the cell phone still clutched in his trembling right hand. The little red light on the screen was still blinking steadily. "I am not giving you a dime," I replied, offering him a smile that held zero warmth. "You started a live stream when you arrived at these gates. You wanted to create a viral spectacle to embarrass me in front of my son's academy. You wanted an audience." Jason looked down at his phone, his confusion morphing into sudden stark terror as my words registered. "I highly recommend you check your viewer count, Jason," I instructed smoothly, "because you just broadcast a full, detailed, uncoerced confession of felony drink, spiking sexual assault, and a 16-year-old criminal conspiracy engineered by my sister. You just admitted on a live public platform that Ashley paid you to drug and assault a minor." Barbara let out another piercing scream, burying her face in her hands. Richard grabbed the iron bars, violently shaking them in a display of utter panic. "Turn it off!" Richard roared at Jason, spit flying from his lips. "Turn the phone off right now, you idiot!" Jason fumbled with the device, his thumb slipping frantically across the glass screen, but the damage was irreversible. The digital footprint was forever. "It is too late," I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through their panic. "My legal team monitors all public mentions of my name and my company. They have already captured the stream. They have archived the footage. Our audience was listening, Jason. And more importantly, the district attorney is listening." I turned my gaze to my father, who was currently watching his entire legacy, his reputation, and his favorite daughter's freedom vaporize before his eyes. "Ashley is going to prison, Richard," I stated with absolute finality. "Jason is going to prison for extortion and assault. And if you attempt to file that fraudulent custody agreement tomorrow morning, you will join them for conspiracy to commit medical fraud." I turned away from the iron gates, placing a hand on Leo's shoulder. "We are finished here," I told my son. "Let us go home." We walked back to the armored SUV without looking back. Behind us, the sounds of Richard screaming, Barbara wailing, and Jason frantically cursing echoed through the pristine hills of Silicon Valley. It was the sound of total, unavoidable destruction. I had not just defeated them, I had forced them to orchestrate their own public execution. The war was over. I had won. The ride back to my estate from the academy was enveloped in a comfortable, absolute silence. Leo sat beside me, scrolling through his tablet, completely unbothered by the dramatic implosion he had just orchestrated. He had looked the monsters in the eye and recognized them for what they were: small, greedy, and irrelevant. By the time we pulled through my security gates, the internet had already done its job. Jason's live stream had been downloaded, clipped, and redistributed across every major social media platform and news network. The narrative had violently shifted. I was no longer the ruthless corporate billionaire withholding a child from his loving family. I was a survivor of a calculated, horrific assault engineered by my own sister and covered up by my parents. But public opinion, while satisfying, does not issue legal rulings. Family court does. And Richard, despite facing imminent criminal charges for conspiracy and extortion, had already paid a high-powered family law attorney to file the emergency paternity suit. Later that evening, I sat in my home office with Mr. Harrison. He was pacing the length of my Persian rug, reviewing the heavily padded legal filing Jason's lawyer had submitted to the California Superior Court. "We have the digital confession," Mr. Harrison stated, tapping his pen against his leather folder. Jason admitted on camera that the original custody document was a product of coercion and a financial transaction initiated by your sister. He admitted he was paid $50,000 by your father just to file this current petition. The district attorney is already preparing criminal warrants for extortion and conspiracy. We can take this video straight to the family court judge tomorrow morning and have Jason's paternity suit thrown out before we even sit down. We can block the DNA test permanently based on criminal fraud. I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers. I looked at my brilliant, cautious lawyer. "Do not block the paternity suit, Mr. Harrison," I commanded smoothly. He stopped pacing and stared at me, genuine confusion crossing his face. "Rachel, if we do not file an emergency injunction to block the petition, the judge will order a mandatory DNA swab. That is standard protocol when a man presents a notarized 16-year-old custody agreement, regardless of the surrounding circus." "I am well aware of the protocol," I replied. "If the DNA test proves he is the biological father, it grants him standing." Mr. Harrison urged, his voice dropping into a tone of serious legal warning. "Yes, he is a criminal. Yes, he will likely go to prison. But family courts operate on biology first. Establishing biological paternity gives his lawyer a wedge to drag this out. They will demand supervised visitation. They will use it as leverage to delay the criminal proceedings. We have the weapon to stop the DNA test right now. Why give him a single inch of legal ground?" I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking my heavily guarded grounds. The night was pitch black, perfectly reflecting my mood. "Because simply throwing his case out is a dismissal," I said softly. "A dismissal allows Richard and Barbara to tell their country club friends that they were defeated by expensive lawyers and a corrupt system. It allows Jason to claim he was denied his rights. I do not want a dismissal, Mr. Harrison. I want an execution." I turned to face him, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "I want you to let them walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning," I instructed. "Do not file the injunction. Do not block the petition. I want Jason, Richard, and Barbara to sit in that room under oath. I want the judge present. I want the media in the gallery. Bring in as many reporters as the bailiffs will legally allow. Let them build their entire desperate strategy around the absolute certainty that Jason is the biological father. And when the judge asks if we object to a court-ordered DNA test, you will stand up and say we wholeheartedly agree to it." Mr. Harrison looked at me for a long, silent moment. He had worked for me long enough to recognize the precise moment I was setting a lethal corporate trap. He slowly closed his leather folder. "You want them to take the test?" He stated, a slow realization dawning in his eyes. "I want the court to mandate it," I corrected. "I want the results read into the public record." The double doors of courtroom 4B swung open. I walked in, followed closely by Mr. Harrison and Leo, who moved with the effortless, synchronized grace of a perfectly orchestrated tactical unit. The gallery, already buzzing with nervous, chaotic energy from the reporters, fell into a sudden, pin-drop silence. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the metallic tang of impending legal violence. We took our seats at the defense table. I did not glance at my parents. I did not acknowledge Jason or Ashley, who was sitting in the gallery, clutching a tissue and attempting to look like a desperate, loving mother, rather than a sociopathic architect of a 16-year-old criminal conspiracy. I simply arranged my files, my movements precise and entirely devoid of emotion. At the petitioner's table, the atmosphere was a toxic mixture of arrogance and poorly concealed panic. Jason was sweating through his cheap suit, his eyes darting frantically toward the gallery where the press corps sat, their pens poised over legal pads. He knew his live-streamed confession was a loaded gun, but he also knew his high-priced lawyer was about to launch a biological Hail Mary. Richard sat rigidly, projecting the image of a wronged patriarch, while Barbara continued her theatrical silent weeping. Judge Davies, a woman whose stern features suggested she had seen every variation of familial dysfunction, entered the courtroom. The bailiff called the room to order. The heavy thud of the judge's gavel echoed sharply, cutting through the lingering tension. "We are here today regarding a highly unusual and frankly disturbing petition for the establishment of paternity and enforcement of joint custody filed by Mr. Jason Miller regarding a minor Leo." Judge Davies announced, her voice dry and authoritative. "Given the extensive unauthorized public exposure this case has received over the last 48 hours, I expect strict adherence to courtroom decorum. Counsel for the petitioner, you may proceed." Jason's lawyer, A slick, aggressively confident attorney named Vance stood up and smoothed his silk tie. He walked toward the center of the room, preparing to deliver a performance designed entirely for the cameras he knew were waiting outside. Your Honor. Vance began, his voice booming with manufactured indignation. We are here to rectify a gross 16-year-old injustice. My client, Mr. Jason Miller, is the biological father of Leo. We have submitted a notarized, legally binding joint custody agreement signed by the mother, Rachel, mere days after the child's birth. For 16 years, this mother has engaged in a deliberate, malicious campaign of parental alienation, hiding the child, changing her contact information, and actively denying my client his fundamental right to be a father. He paused, looking pointedly at me, attempting to establish eye contact. I stared back, my expression entirely blank, yielding absolutely nothing. Furthermore, Your Honor, Vance continued, his voice dropping an octave to inject maximum dramatic effect. We are not just fighting for a father's right to know his son, we are fighting for a child's life. The minor Leo is a perfect biological match for his cousin, who is currently suffering from end-stage renal failure. The mother, out of pure vindictive spite, is refusing to allow Leo to undergo the necessary medical screening to become a donor. She is willing to let a child die to maintain her spiteful control. We are formally requesting an immediate court-ordered DNA swab to establish paternity beyond a shadow of a doubt. Once paternity is established, my client intends to assume his rightful legal authority and consent to the medical procedures necessary to save his nephew's life. Vance sat down, looking incredibly pleased with his delivery. He had successfully reframed a vile extortion attempt into a noble crusade for a dying child. It was a masterful, disgusting piece of legal theater. In the gallery, Ashley let out a loud, shuddering sob, burying her face in her hands. Richard placed a comforting hand on his daughter's shoulder, nodding sagely at the judge. They were playing their roles perfectly, absolute conviction radiating from their table. They truly believed that biology would conquer everything. They believed that a DNA test was the ultimate, unassailable weapon. Judge Davies turned her sharp gaze to our table. Counsel for the defense, she said, her tone indicating she expected a vicious, immediate objection to the DNA request. Mr. Harrison stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate, agonizing calm. He did not raise his voice. He did not employ theatrical gestures. He simply projected the quiet, terrifying confidence of a man holding a royal flush. Your Honor, Mr. Harrison stated, his voice ringing clearly in the quiet courtroom, the defense has reviewed the petitioner's request for a mandatory DNA test to establish paternity. He paused, letting the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment. He looked across the aisle at Jason, who was gripping the edge of his table, visibly bracing for a legal brawl. The defense has no objections, Mr. Harrison stated smoothly. In fact, we fully welcome the court-ordered DNA test. We request the swabs be taken immediately here in the courthouse clinic and rushed for priority processing. A collective stunned gasp echoed through the gallery. The reporters furiously scribbled on their notepads, completely bewildered by the sudden surrender. At the petitioner's table, the reaction was immediate and entirely panicked. Jason did not look victorious. He looked terrified. His eyes went wide as he stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He knew me. He knew I would never willingly hand over a weapon that could be used against my son, unless I already knew the weapon was going to explode in his hands. Richard leaned forward, his face draining of color, his calculating mind desperately trying to figure out why I had just surrendered my strongest legal defense. He looked at Vance, his eyes wide with frantic, unspoken questions. Barbara dropped her tissue, her theatrical weeping abruptly halted by pure confusion. Even Judge Davies looked momentarily caught off guard. You are explicitly consenting to the DNA test, counsel, she asked, leaning forward, wanting to ensure it was entered correctly into the record. You are waiving your right to challenge the petition prior to establishing biological standing. We absolutely consent. Your Honor, Mr. Harrison confirmed, remaining standing, his posture relaxed. My client has nothing to hide regarding the biological parentage of her son. We believe the results of this test will be highly illuminating for all parties involved. Vance jumped to his feet, suddenly sensing a trap, but unable to identify it. Your Honor, this is highly unusual. The defense is usually fiercely opposed to establishing paternity in these cases. I request a brief recess to confer with my client. Denied. Judge Davies snapped, banging her gavel. You requested a DNA test, Mr. Vance. The defense has consented. We will proceed immediately. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Miller and the minor Leo to the courthouse clinic. We will reconvene as soon as the expedited results are available. Leo stood up. He did not look at Jason. He did not look at his grandparents. He adjusted his expensive blazer, offering me a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning and following the bailiff out of the courtroom, his two massive security contractors shadowing his every move. Jason was forced to follow, his legs practically shaking as he walked down the aisle. He looked back at me one last time before exiting the heavy oak doors. His eyes were wide with a creeping primal terror. He finally realized he was not walking toward a payday. He was walking toward his own execution. The heavy mahogany doors swung open exactly 45 minutes later. Jason stumbled back into the courtroom, his skin a sickening shade of gray, completely devoid of the arrogant swagger he had walked in with. He practically collapsed into the chair next to Richard, his hands shaking so violently he had to hide them beneath the heavy wooden table. Leo followed moments later, his posture perfect, his expression utterly bored, as he took his seat beside me. He looked like a CEO, waiting for a tedious board meeting to conclude. Judge Davies tapped her gavel, bringing the packed, whispering gallery to an immediate halt. She adjusted her glasses, looking directly at the petitioner's table with an expression of strict judicial impatience. "We are reconvened," Judge Davies announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "The court understands that the expedited DNA samples have been processed by the courthouse clinic. Mr. Vance, do you have the results to submit to the record?" Vance stood up aggressively, adjusting his silk tie, eager to secure his win. He looked like a man who thought he had just struck gold, completely blind to the landmine he was standing on. "Yes, Your Honor," Vance proclaimed loudly, projecting his voice so the press gallery caught every single syllable. "The clinic has confirmed the biological match. Jason Miller is without a doubt the biological father of the minor child Leo. Therefore, my client's joint custody agreement is activated. We request immediate legal authority over the minor's medical decisions to proceed with the kidney transplant evaluation for his dying nephew." Ashley let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief from the gallery, clutching her chest as if she had just witnessed a miracle. Barbara clasped her hands in prayer, looking up at the ceiling. Richard puffed out his chest, a triumphant, malicious sneer forming on his lips. They had their biological proof. They thought the game was over. They thought they had finally broken me. Judge Davies turned her sharp gaze to our table. "Mr. Harrison, do you wish to cross-examine these findings before I rule on the custody enforcement?" Mr. Harrison stood up slowly. He picked up a thick, leather-bound folder from our table and walked to the center of the room. He did not hand the judge a lab report. He did not look panicked. He projected the quiet, terrifying confidence of a man holding a royal flush. "The defense acknowledges the biological reality, Your Honor," Mr. Harrison said, his voice deadly calm. "However, the biological reality is entirely and legally irrelevant to this proceeding. We are not submitting a DNA rebuttal. We are submitting a federal emancipation decree." He handed one certified copy to the bailiff to pass to the judge and dropped another copy directly onto Vance's table. It hit the wood with a heavy, definitive thud that sounded like a coffin slamming shut. The courtroom went entirely silent. Vance stared at the document as if it were a live grenade. 6 months ago, Mr. Harrison continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "My client Leo petitioned the federal court for full legal emancipation. Given his status as the primary shareholder of Aegis Medical Solutions, his extensive independent wealth, and his demonstrated extraordinary maturity, the federal judge granted the petition without hesitation. Leo is legally recognized as a fully independent sovereign adult in the United States." I watched the color drain completely from Richard's face. The triumphant sneer melted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. He understood exactly what this meant. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. You are attempting to sue for custody of an adult, Mr. Harrison stated, looking directly at Jason, whose jaw had dropped open in shock. You have no legal standing. No one has custody over Leo. Furthermore, no court, no parent, and certainly no biological sperm donor has the legal authority to force a sovereign, emancipated adult to undergo an invasive medical procedure or donate an organ. Your entire petition is legally impossible. Vance scrambled to read through the decree, his hands shaking violently as his eyes darted across the federal seal. Your Honor, he stammered, his voice pitching high with sudden panic. We had no prior knowledge of this emancipation. This changes the nature of the custody agreement. But my client still possesses a valid contract signed by the mother 16 years ago. It proves intent. Judge Davies looked over her glasses at Vance, her expression turning incredibly dangerous. You are treading on incredibly thin ice, counselor. That is where you are catastrophically wrong. Mr. Vance. Mr. Harrison interrupted smoothly. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second, older-looking folder. Because the document your client submitted to this court today is a crude, desperate forgery. Barbara gasped loudly. Ashley jumped up from her seat in the gallery before sitting back down quickly under the severe glare of a bailiff. I am submitting into evidence a legally binding contract drafted and executed exactly 16 years ago, Mr. Harrison announced, handing the new yellowed document to the judge. This is not a custody agreement. This is a non-disclosure and severance contract. Mr. Harrison turned to face the gallery, ensuring the press heard every single detail of the incoming destruction. 16 years ago, Richard Wilson paid Jason Miller exactly $10,000 to permanently waive any and all parental rights. Mr. Harrison declared, his words hitting like physical blows. The contract explicitly outlines that Jason Miller accepted this bribe to vanish, specifically to isolate my client Rachel and coerce her into terminating her pregnancy. Jason Miller surrendered every conceivable legal right to this child before Leo was even born. He sold his paternity for cash. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The journalists stopped writing, too stunned to even take notes. Therefore, Mr. Harrison continued, delivering the final fatal strike. The joint custody agreement Jason Miller presented to this court today is a fraudulent document. A document manufactured by Richard Wilson and Jason Miller to extort my client. They knowingly submitted forged legal documents to a family court judge in a conspired attempt to harvest an organ from an emancipated minor. Judge Davies slammed her gavel down so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot. Her face was a mask of pure judicial fury. She looked down at the petitioner's table as if looking at a pile of garbage. Mr. Vance, Judge Davies roared, her voice shaking the wood paneling of the courtroom. Is your client aware that committing perjury, submitting forged legal documents, and attempting to commit medical fraud are severe federal felony offenses? Vance physically backed away from his own client, creating as much distance as the small space allowed. He threw his hands up in the air, his face pale with professional terror. Your Honor, I was not aware. I was presented with the custody document by Richard Wilson. I was assured it was authentic. I request immediate permission to withdraw as counsel for Mr. Miller. You sold me out! Jason suddenly screamed, leaping to his feet and lunging toward Richard's chair. You told me the custody paper would hold up. You told me the emancipation thing was just a rumor to scare us. You dragged me into federal fraud. Richard scrambled backward, tripping over his own chair and falling heavily onto the courtroom floor. He scrambled against the wooden railing, looking like a cornered, pathetic animal. The grand patriarch of the Wilson family was reduced to crawling on the carpet to escape his own hired thug. Bailiffs, secure the petitioner, Judge Davies ordered sharply. Two armed bailiffs immediately tackled Jason, pressing him against the heavy oak table and securing his hands behind his back with zip ties. The press gallery erupted into a frenzy of camera flashes and shouted questions, completely ignoring the rules of decorum. They had the story of the decade. A wealthy patriarch exposed as a fraud, a fake custody battle, and a federal crime unraveled in real time. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the table in front of me. I looked down at my father, who was currently sprawled on the floor. His expensive suit rumpled, his dignity entirely shredded. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. He wanted me to call it off. He wanted his quiet, compliant daughter to step in and save him from the consequences of his own monstrous greed. I did not flinch. I did not offer him a single shred of mercy. I simply offered him a cold, empty smile. The trap had snapped shut, and there was no way out. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the bailiffs, sealing Jason's fate and leaving a ringing silence in their wake. The immediate threat of the biological father was neutralized, carted off to a holding cell, but the architects of the misery remained. Richard pushed himself up from the floor. He leaned heavily against the petitioner's table, his breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. His custom-tailored suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, but the toxic, ingrained arrogance that had defined his entire existence refused to die quietly. He looked around the courtroom, taking in the sea of reporters furiously typing on their phones, broadcasting his utter humiliation to the world. He realized his pristine social standing. The country club memberships, the board seats, and the carefully cultivated image of the righteous patriarch were evaporating in real time. Instead of showing remorse, his panic mutated into a blinding, venomous rage. He locked eyes with me, his face turning a mottled, dangerous shade of crimson. "You ungrateful brat!" Richard roared, his voice echoing off the high ceiling, completely ignoring the judge sitting just a few feet away. "You think you have won because you got rid of that idiot? You think you can humiliate me in public and just walk away? No matter what happens here today, my family will sue your company for defamation. You set us up. You entrapped us. I have lawyers who will tie Aegis Medical Solutions up in litigation for the next decade. I will bankrupt you. I will take every single penny you have built and strip you down to nothing." Ashley, emboldened by her father's outburst, jumped up from her seat in the gallery. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. "She is a liar!" Ashley shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "She manufactured that federal decree. She is trying to steal my son's life-saving transplant. Do not let her do this, Dad. Destroy her." Judge Davies grabbed her gavel, raising it high to bring the chaotic room back under control, but she never got the chance to strike it. Leo moved. My 16-year-old son stood up from his chair. He did not rush. He did not show a single ounce of teenage adrenaline or emotional instability. He smoothed the lapels of his charcoal blazer, checked his vintage Patek Philippe watch with chilling nonchalance, and stepped out from behind the defense table. He walked directly toward the center of the courtroom, bypassing Mr. Harrison, bypassing me, and stopping just a few feet away from the wooden barricade that separated the legal teams from the gallery. He held a massive, thick black binder in his right hand. The sheer presence of the boy, the terrifying, predatory calm radiating from him, caused Richard's rant to die in his throat. Ashley froze in the gallery, her mouth hanging open. The reporters stopped typing, leaning forward in their seats. Leo lifted the thick black binder and dropped it flat onto the petitioner's table right in front of Richard. It hit the solid wood with a massive, heavy thud that sounded like a vault door slamming shut. "Mr. Richard," Leo said. His voice was not raised, but it carried a lethal, freezing authority that demanded absolute attention. He did not call him grandfather. He addressed him like a subordinate who was about to be fired. "Your threat of bankruptcy is highly amusing," Leo continued, his dark eyes locking onto the older man's terrified face. "But it is also mathematically impossible. You see, to fund a decade of corporate litigation, you would need liquid capital. You would need assets. You would need credit. You currently possess none of those things." Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his bravado entirely replaced by a sudden creeping dread. "I am talking about Wilson Estate Holdings," Leo stated, naming Richard's primary real estate development firm. "I am talking about the fact that for the past 5 years, you have been hemorrhaging money. You took out massive high-interest commercial mortgages to cover the operational losses of your failing strip malls. You leveraged your own commercial properties to maintain your lifestyle, to pay for your country club dues, and to fund the extravagant vanity projects of your favorite daughter over there in the gallery." Ashley let out a sharp gasp, sinking back into her seat as the spotlight of Leo's scrutiny shifted to include her. You mortgaged all your remaining assets to Vanguard Bank. Leo explained, his tone clinical and precise, breaking down the financial ruin of the man standing before him. You thought you could float the debt until the market turned. But the market did not turn. Your commercial properties have a 40% vacancy rate. Vanguard Bank flagged your portfolio as toxic. They classified your entire corporate existence as a bad debt. Richard was physically shaking now. His eyes darted to the black binder sitting on the table. He reached out a trembling hand, but Leo slammed his own hand down on top of the cover, pinning it in place. "Do not touch that yet," Leo commanded softly. "I am not finished explaining your current reality." Barbara began to weep again, a high-pitched, keening sound of pure panic. She looked at her husband, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to tell the room that the boy was lying. Richard said nothing. He could not deny it. Every word Leo spoke was a verifiable, devastating financial fact. Last month, Vanguard Bank decided to offload a massive bundle of toxic commercial mortgages to clean up their quarterly balance sheets. Leo continued his gaze, never leaving Richard's sweating face. A private equity firm stepped in and bought 100% of that bad debt. They bought your mortgages, Richard. They bought the paper on your strip malls. They bought the paper on your corporate headquarters. They bought it all for pennies on the dollar because your credit rating is completely worthless. Richard swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively. Who, he managed to whisper. Who bought it? The name of the private equity firm is LR Capital. Leo stated, his voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. Coincidentally, I am the sole CEO of this fund. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a vacuum sucking the oxygen out of the space. The reporters in the gallery stopped breathing. Judge Davies lowered her gavel, watching the absolute dismantling of the petitioner with wide, fascinated eyes. LR Capital. Leo Rachel Capital. The realization hit Richard like a physical blow to the chest. He staggered backward, his legs giving out completely. He fell into his chair, his chest heaving as he stared at the 16-year-old boy who now owned his entire financial existence. "You," Richard gasped, his voice trembling. "You bought my debt." "I did not just buy your corporate debt," Leo corrected, stepping away from the table and gesturing toward Ashley in the gallery. "I bought the secondary residential mortgages bundled into that package. You see, when you started running out of commercial collateral, you used personal assets to secure those high-interest loans." Leo turned his cold, dead eyes to Ashley. She was pressing herself back against the wooden bench, looking like she wanted to melt into the floorboards. "Aunt Ashley's house is also on my foreclosure list," Leo announced, his voice slicing through the quiet room. "The pristine 6-bedroom estate in the gated community. The one you used as collateral to secure a bridge loan to keep your failing lifestyle afloat. You defaulted on that loan 90 days ago. Vanguard was preparing to seize it. LR Capital expedited the paperwork." Ashley let out a horrified, guttural scream. "No!" she shrieked, standing up and gripping the wooden rail. "You cannot do that. That is my home. That is where my sick child lives. You cannot throw us out. Dad, tell him he cannot do this." I looked at my sister, watching the golden child completely unravel. For 16 years she had relied on our parents to clean up her messes, to fund her life, to shield her from the consequences of her own sociopathic behavior. Now the shield was gone. The bank was empty. "Your father cannot tell me to do anything," Leo replied to Ashley, not raising his voice but ensuring every word carried the weight of absolute authority. "Because he no longer owns his own home either." Barbara let out a sharp cry, grabbing Richard's arm. "Richard, tell me he is lying. Tell me the house is safe." Richard just stared straight ahead, his eyes glazed over with shock. "The ancestral home," Leo continued, looking back at his grandparents. "The mansion where you hosted your cocktail parties. The mansion where you threw my pregnant mother out into a freezing blizzard to protect your social standing. That property was fully leveraged to Vanguard Bank 3 years ago. You missed the last 4 payments." Leo reached out, finally flipping open the thick black binder. He extracted a stack of legally certified, heavily stamped documents and slid them across the table toward Richard. "These are the final foreclosure notices," Leo stated. "They have already been filed with the county clerk. They have already been approved by a judge. The grace periods have expired. The eviction mandates are active. Leo leaned over the table, bringing his face inches from Richard's pale, sweating forehead. You came here today attempting to use biology as a weapon, Leo whispered, his voice dark and merciless. You thought you could use a forged piece of paper to force me onto an operating table. You have no right to be my grandparents. You have no right to speak my name. But starting at 8 o'clock this morning, you are officially my homeless debtors. The destruction was absolute. Barbara physically collapsed against the table, sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her arms as the reality of her new life set in. No country club, no mansion, no social standing. She was ruined. Ashley abandoned her post in the gallery. She shoved past the reporters, ignoring the flashing cameras, and ran toward the barricade. She pointed a frantic, desperate finger at Richard. "This is your fault!" Ashley screamed at her father, her face contorted with ugly, vicious rage. "You told me the bridge loan was safe. You told me putting up my house was just a formality. You lost my home. You lost everything because you are a terrible businessman." Richard snapped out of his shock, his own rage reigniting as his favorite daughter turned on him in front of the world. "Do not you dare speak to me like that," he roared back, slamming his fist on the table. "I bankrupted this company paying for your mistakes. I paid off Jason 16 years ago to protect you. I funded your entire worthless existence. You are a parasite. You are a failure!" Ashley shrieked back, tears of pure selfishness streaming down her face. "You brought Jason here. You ruined us today." It was a masterpiece of karmic retribution. The unified front, the perfect, pristine facade of the Wilson family, was eating itself alive right there on the courtroom floor. They were tearing each other to pieces, desperate to shift the blame, desperate to escape the crushing weight of their own actions. Judge Davies watched the spectacle with an expression of profound disgust. She banged her gavel repeatedly, the sharp sound finally cutting through the hysterical screaming of my ruined family. "Silence." Judge Davies commanded, her voice booming with absolute judicial authority. "I will have the bailiffs clear this entire room if I hear another word." Richard, Barbara, and Ashley froze, terrified by the threat of being dragged out in handcuffs like Jason. They slumped back, breathing heavily, surrounded by the wreckage of their empire. Judge Davies turned her attention to the documents Mr. Harrison had submitted. She reviewed the federal emancipation decree. She reviewed the 16-year-old payoff contract between Richard and Jason. She looked at the foreclosure documents Leo had placed on the table. "The court has reviewed the submitted evidence," Judge Davies announced, her tone icy and definitive. "The petition for paternity and custody enforcement is denied and dismissed with extreme prejudice. The petitioner, Jason Miller, has no legal standing as the minor in question is a legally emancipated adult under federal law. Furthermore, the court is deeply disturbed by the evidence of fraud, forgery, and extortion presented today. I am forwarding all transcripts and documents from this proceeding directly to the District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal review regarding Mr. Richard Wilson and Ms. Ashley Wilson." Richard buried his face in his hands. Ashley slumped against the wooden barricade, her eyes wide with terror as the word "criminal" echoed in the room. "This case is closed," Judge Davies declared, bringing the gavel down one final time. I stood up from the defense table. I smoothed my white suit jacket, perfectly composed, entirely untouched by the emotional carnage surrounding me. Leo stepped back to my side, his posture identical to mine. We looked at the three people who had spent 16 years believing they were untouchable. They were currently weeping, shaking, and staring at a future devoid of wealth, status, and freedom. They had nothing left. I did not offer them a parting word. They were no longer worth the oxygen required to speak. I turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The reporters parted like the Red Sea, clearing a path for us. Leo walked beside me, our security detail falling into perfect formation behind us. We pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the courthouse steps. The storm had passed. The air was crisp and clean. We had executed the purge flawlessly. We were the only ones left standing. We had barely made it halfway down the sweeping, sun-drenched concrete steps of the courthouse plaza when the frantic commotion behind us reached a fever pitch. The heavy glass doors we had just exited violently burst open again, spitting the remnants of my ruined family out into the blinding daylight. Ashley was the first to stumble out her voice, a ragged, hysterical screech that cut through the ambient noise of the city traffic and the shouting press corps. She was looking frantically around the plaza, her manicured hands grasping at the empty air. She spotted Jason being shoved unceremoniously into the back of a federal marshal's transport vehicle at the bottom of the ramp. He was handcuffed, his head pushed down, utterly defeated. Ashley lunged in his direction, her expensive heels slipping on the smooth concrete. She screamed his name, demanding her money, demanding compensation for her impending homelessness, demanding that he take the fall so she could somehow salvage her parasitic lifestyle. Jason did not even turn his head. He threw his body into the back of the cruiser, desperately trying to put a solid steel door between himself and the terrifying reality of his federal extortion charges. The marshals slammed the door shut, cutting off Ashley's shrieks, and the vehicle sped away, leaving her grasping at the exhaust fumes. She collapsed against a stone planter, sliding down to the dirty pavement, burying her face in her hands in a state of absolute shattered catatonia. Her meal ticket was gone. Her mansion was gone. Her entire identity, built entirely on the stolen wealth of others, had evaporated into thin air. But it was Richard and Barbara who provided the final spectacular act of this tragedy. They emerged from this courthouse completely stripped of the arrogant, impenetrable armor they had worn for their entire lives. They looked like two hollow, terrified ghosts. The flashing cameras of the assembled journalists immediately pivoted toward them, capturing every microscopic detail of their ultimate humiliation. Richard's legs, weakened by the sheer crushing weight of his instantaneous financial annihilation, simply gave out. He stumbled on the top step, his arms flailing before dropping heavily onto his hands and knees. The man who had terrorized boardrooms, who had dictated my worth based entirely on a balance sheet, was now crawling on the filthy public concrete. Barbara followed him down. The polished, vicious matriarch of the Wilson family threw herself down the steps, completely ignoring the reporters, ignoring the cameras, and ignoring the shreds of her own dignity. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive silk dress tearing against the rough stone. She reached the step just above where I was standing and threw her body forward, her trembling hands reaching out to grab the hem of my immaculate white suit. I stopped. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still on the marble step, looking down at them from above. The cacophony of the press corps, the shouting photographers, and the distant city sirens seemed to instantly fade into a vacuum of profound silence. "Rachel, please," Barbara wailed, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob that echoed across the plaza. "Please look at me. I am begging you. Do not do this. Do not take our home. Where are we supposed to go? We have nothing left. We are completely ruined." She looked up at me, tears carving dark, muddy tracks through her heavy makeup. Her eyes were wide with a primal, desperate terror. She was trying to find a lifeline, trying to locate the weak, desperate, approval-seeking daughter she had spent years systematically breaking down. "Rachel, I am your mother." Barbara sobbed, her fingers gripping the fabric of my trousers with white-knuckled desperation. "Despite everything that has happened, I am the one who gave birth to you. We are family. We are blood. You cannot throw your own flesh and blood out into the street. Have some mercy on us. Please, I am begging you on my knees." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I searched my own chest for a heartbeat of sympathy, a flicker of guilt, or even a sudden surge of vindictive rage. There was nothing. There was no hatred left. There was no urge to scream at her. There was no desire to recount the endless nights I had cried myself to sleep, praying for just a fraction of the maternal love she showered so effortlessly onto Ashley. There was only the vast, deep, absolute stillness of a superior staring down at a defeated enemy. 16 years ago, I said. My voice was quiet, yet it carried an icy, piercing clarity that made the surrounding journalists stop breathing. The words hung in the warm California air, freezing everything they touched. 16 years ago, in the middle of a blinding blizzard, you stood in the doorway of your massive warm house. I continued maintaining eye contact with the weeping woman below me. I was 18 years old. I was pregnant. I was terrified. I was bleeding. And I was begging for my mother to help me. Barbara squeezed her eyes shut, a fresh wave of panicked tears spilling over her cheeks, shaking her head as if she could physically reject the memory I was forcing her to confront. "Do you remember what you told me that night?" I asked, my tone clinical and entirely devoid of emotion. "Do you remember the exact words you used before you slammed that heavy oak door in my face and locked the deadbolt?" Richard let out a choked, devastated groan, dropping his forehead against the concrete step. He remembered. They both remembered. It was the night they had finalized their own destruction. They just had not realized it until this exact second. "You looked me dead in the eye," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. "And you told me that losers have no right to stay in your house. You told me that I was a stain on the family name and that failures did not get to seek shelter under your roof." I reached down and calmly, firmly peeled Barbara's trembling fingers off my suit. I brushed the fabric flat, ensuring not a single wrinkle remained from her desperate grasp. "Today, I am returning exactly that sentence to you," I declared, looking down at her ruined, terrified face. "Your financial status is a toxic liability. Your mortgages are fully defaulted. Your grace periods are non-existent. You are a failure, Barbara, and losers have no right to stay in my houses." Barbara collapsed entirely, her forehead resting against my shoe, her shoulders heaving with uncontrollable, hysterical sobs. "Do not call me your daughter." I finalized, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like a thunderclap in the silent plaza. "I am your creditor, and your debt is being called in today." I stepped smoothly around her prone body. Leo was standing right beside me. He had not said a word during the entire exchange. He did not need to. His presence was absolute. He looked down at the weeping grandparents who had tried to steal his organs and extort his mother, and his expression was a mask of pure, unadulterated boredom. They were no longer a threat. They were a finalized transaction. They were a closed file. Leo raised his right hand, giving a sharp, concise two-finger signal to the team of private security contractors waiting at the bottom of the steps. The response was instantaneous. The massive suited men moved with military precision. They surged up the steps, forming an impenetrable, solid human wall between us and the collapsed figures of Richard and Barbara. They blocked the reporters. They blocked the cameras. They effectively blocked my former family from ever reaching me again. The security perimeter moved with us, creating a clear, secure path down the remaining stairs toward the idling armored SUV. I did not look back. I did not turn my head to see Richard pounding his fists against the concrete, or Barbara reaching desperately through the legs of the security guards. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the horizon, on the bright, blinding sunlight reflecting off the polished black exterior of the waiting car. One of the security contractors pulled the heavy rear door open. I slid into the cool, dark luxury of the leather interior. Leo stepped in right behind me, sliding into his seat and immediately pulling his tablet from his briefcase. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing us inside a soundproof vault of our own making. The chaotic, frantic screaming of the plaza vanished instantly, replaced by the soft, steady hum of the vehicle's powerful engine. "Drive," Leo instructed the driver, his tone perfectly even. The SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the courthouse, the flashing cameras, and the ruined, kneeling figures of the Wilson family rapidly fading in the rearview mirror. I leaned my head back against the seat and looked out the tinted window. The city looked different today. The colors were sharper, the air felt cleaner. The monumental, suffocating shadow that had hovered over my life for 16 years had been permanently eradicated. I had built an empire from the ashes they left me in, and I had used that empire to buy their entire world. I turned my head and looked at Leo. My brilliant, ruthless, extraordinary son was already typing an email authorizing the final liquidation of the Wilson commercial assets. He was not dwelling on the past. He was already building the future. We had executed the purge. We had balanced the ledger. And for the first time in my entire life, the ledger belonged entirely to me. The weeks that followed our departure from the courthouse were a masterclass in swift, merciless corporate and legal destruction. We did not have to lift another finger. We simply watched the spectacular implosion of the Wilson empire unfold across the front pages of every major financial publication and evening news broadcast. Judge Davies was a woman of her word. The transcripts and evidence from that disastrous hearing were expedited directly to the district attorney, who immediately launched a full-scale criminal investigation. But the local prosecutors were just the beginning. Once Leo pulled the foundational linchpin out of Richard's fragile financial structure, the entire house of cards collapsed, burying them all in the rubble. Richard's downfall was absolute and staggering in its velocity. The revelation of the forged legal documents and the attempted medical extortion triggered a massive audit of Wilson estate holdings. Federal investigators descended on his corporate headquarters like a swarm of locusts. They seized servers, froze bank accounts, and hauled out boxes of financial records. It did not take them long to discover that the fraudulent behavior Richard exhibited in family court was a direct mirror of how he ran his business. The IRS uncovered years of rampant tax fraud, systematic embezzlement, and massive misappropriation of corporate funds. Richard had been using investors' money to maintain his country club lifestyle and artificially inflate his failing commercial properties. Within a month, he was formally indicted on 22 counts of federal financial crimes. The man who had spent his entire life demanding absolute obedience and ruling his family with an iron fist was publicly led out of his foreclosed mansion in handcuffs. Barbara, stripped of the wealth and social standing that had entirely defined her existence, became an instant pariah. The elite circles she had ruthlessly clawed her way into slammed their doors in her face. Her country club membership was revoked. Her fair-weather friends stopped returning her calls. The charities she used to chair publicly disavowed her. When the bank finally arrived to padlock the front doors of the ancestral estate, Barbara was forced to pack her designer clothes into black garbage bags. With Richard awaiting trial in a federal holding facility, she had nowhere to go. The woman who had thrown her pregnant teenage daughter out into a freezing blizzard ended up moving into a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of the city, utterly forgotten by the world she had worshipped. Jason did not fare any better. His desperate sprint from the courthouse only delayed the inevitable by 48 hours. Federal marshals tracked him down to a dilapidated bus station 2 states over, attempting to buy a ticket across the border with the last of his cash. Facing a mountain of indisputable evidence, including the original payoff contract and his own perjury on the stand, Jason took a blind plea deal. He was sentenced to a mandatory minimum in a federal penitentiary for extortion and fraud, permanently removing his violent, opportunistic shadow from our lives. But it was Ashley's descent that was perhaps the most poetic execution of karmic justice. The moment the foreclosure notices became public, her carefully curated suburban fantasy shattered. Her husband, who had happily enjoyed the perks of Richard's wealth, took one look at the incoming federal investigations, the frozen bank accounts, and the absolute destruction of his father-in-law, and immediately filed for divorce. He fled the sinking ship, taking his own assets and leaving Ashley holding the bag. Ashley declared bankruptcy shortly after. The woman who had sneered at my clothes, who had demanded I sacrifice my own child to fix her problems, found herself entirely alone. She was evicted from the pristine 6-bedroom estate she had relentlessly flaunted. With no career, no husband to support her, and her parents entirely ruined, Ashley was forced to move into a cramped, run-down 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood she used to mock from the tinted windows of her luxury SUV. The linoleum floors were peeling, the walls were thin, and there was no maid to clean up her messes. She was finally forced to live the reality she had always believed was beneath her. However, amidst the wreckage of their lives, there remained one innocent casualty: Ashley's sick child. The boy who had been used as a pawn, a prop, and a weapon by my family. I felt no lingering attachment to Ashley. I felt no obligation to the sister who had happily participated in a conspiracy to violently harvest an organ from my teenage son. But the child had not asked to be born into that toxic lineage. He was sick, he was suffering, and he was completely blameless. I refused to let my morality be compromised by the sins of his mother. I refused to be anything like the people who had raised me. But I also absolutely refused to allow Ashley to use that child as a tether to pull me back into her chaotic parasitic orbit. I contacted the senior legal team at Aegis Medical Solutions. Under my strict directives, they established an independent, completely anonymous charitable trust. The trust was managed by an aggressive third-party proxy firm that specialized in medical philanthropy. Through this proxy, the trust contacted the pediatric nephrology department at the child's hospital directly. We completely bypassed Ashley. We did not send her a single dime. We did not send her a letter, a card, or a message of goodwill. The trust simply settled every single outstanding medical bill the hospital had on file for the boy. Furthermore, the trust fully funded a comprehensive nationwide search for a willing, compatible kidney donor, covering all logistical, surgical, and recovery expenses for the donor and the recipient. Ashley was completely cut out of the financial loop. When she frantically tried to discover the identity of the anonymous benefactor, hoping to exploit them for personal living expenses, the hospital administrators politely informed her that the trust was sealed under an impenetrable non-disclosure agreement. She would never know that the sister she had tried to destroy was the one who quietly, clinically saved her son's life. The debt of basic human decency was paid in full, and the door was permanently welded shut. 6 months after the trial, the air in the city felt entirely different. I stood on the expansive wraparound balcony of the top floor of the Aegis Medical Solutions headquarters. The building was a towering monolith of sleek glass and steel, piercing the downtown skyline. The evening sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a warm, brilliant golden hue over the city below. The frantic, rushing traffic looked like tiny, insignificant toys from this altitude. I leaned against the cool glass railing holding a cup of black coffee, simply listening to the quiet hum of the city. The heavy glass door behind me slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Leo stepped out onto the balcony. He had just finished a 3-hour board meeting regarding the final highly profitable liquidation of the LR Capital acquisitions. He walked over and stood beside me, resting his elbows on the railing, looking out at the sprawling metropolis. He was 16 years old, but he carried the quiet, formidable presence of a man who had conquered the world and found it entirely manageable. We stood in comfortable silence for a long time, the shared understanding of what we had achieved, requiring no actual words. We had not just survived the relentless, suffocating pressure of the Wilson family. We had utilized it to forge ourselves into something unbreakable. They had tried to bury us completely, failing to realize that we were seeds. I looked down at the streets below, thinking about Richard in a federal cell, Barbara in a dingy motel, and Ashley trapped in the exact life she had always dreaded. I felt a profound, settling peace wash over my entire body. I had spent so many years of my youth believing that I was inherently flawed, believing that the lack of love from my parents was a reflection of my own inadequate worth. I had internalized their cruelty, carrying it like a heavy chain around my neck. But standing here, looking at the empire we had built, looking at the extraordinary, brilliant sun standing beside me, the ultimate truth was impossibly clear. People are conditioned to believe that family is an absolute, an unbreakable bond defined strictly by biology and shared DNA. We are taught that we owe our loyalty, our resources, and our very lives to the people who happen to share our genetic markers, regardless of how deeply they wound us. But biology is just a coincidence of birth. It is a starting point, not a life sentence. I turned my head to look at Leo. He caught my gaze, a small, genuine, incredibly rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. In his eyes, I saw the exact same unwavering loyalty, the exact same fierce, protective dedication that had allowed us to walk through the fire and emerge entirely unscathed. Family is not the people who share your blood, but are willing to systematically suck your marrow dry to sustain their own selfish illusions. Family is not a group of predators who demand your sacrifice while offering absolutely nothing in return. Family is not a debt you owe simply because you exist. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over Leo's on the glass railing. He did not pull away. He stood tall, a sovereign force, the greatest achievement of my life. Family is the people you choose. Family is the people who stand beside you when the world turns hostile. Family is the empire you build with your own two hands, constructed from the ashes of the bridges you were forced to burn. It is the people who see your worth, who defend your peace, and who will ruthlessly, relentlessly protect the sanctuary you have built together. I looked back out at the glowing horizon, the sky burning with the promise of tomorrow. We had built our empire from the ashes, and nobody would ever touch it again.